The gentle drizzle whispered against the towering windows of Tech Solutions' Boston headquarters, a soft rhythm that felt like a quiet warning I couldn't quite hear. I stood by my desk, watching the droplets race down the glass, each one a tiny fugitive trying to outrun the pull of the earth. As a child, I'd imagined they were alive, little rebels darting against the weight of time, carrying dreams too fragile to land. But that morning, I couldn't afford to drift into childhood fancies. A cold knot twisted in my stomach, a gut feeling I should have heeded. The office was unnaturally still. The usual hum of keyboards and forced laughter from the break room had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my chest. Whispers drifted through the open-plan space like mist curling around corners, brushing past shoulders with a chill. Something was coming. We all sensed it, a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. An unexpected email pinged into the team's shared inbox. Mandatory all-hands meeting, conference room B now. I grabbed my notepad, more out of habit than need, and joined the stream of colleagues heading toward the glass-walled room at the end of the hall. My flats clicked softly on the polished floor. I tried to keep my expression steady, my hands from trembling, but my stomach knew the truth. Inside, people sat rigid like figures carved from stone, their uncertainty a mirror to my own. Mr. Thorne, the man who could silence a room with a single arched brow, strode in, flanked by two HR reps who moved like extensions of his shadow. He wore his signature black suit and a cruel half-smile that made my skin prickle. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice smooth and sharp, slicing through the tension. "As part of our ongoing strategic alignment, we've had to make difficult decisions to enhance operational efficiency." His gaze found mine, cold and deliberate, pinning me in place. "Amelia Hayes," he said, drawing out each syllable like a blade, after a thorough performance review. "It has been determined that your role no longer aligns with Tech Solutions' goals. Effective immediately, your position is terminated." Silence. A brutal, suffocating silence that made my heartbeat thunder in my ears like a drum. My face burned, then went numb. My throat was dry as sand, and I couldn't swallow. No one looked at me. Not Sarah from Creative, who I'd comforted after her dog passed. Not Ben, who I'd mentored through his first campaign. Not even Lisa, who'd sat beside me for 2 years and borrowed my stapler daily. They stared at their hands, their shoes, anywhere but me, like children playing at being invisible. "You may collect your belongings," Mr. Thorne continued, already flipping to the next slide as if he were discussing office supplies, not shattering someone's dignity in front of 25 people. I stood, but my legs betrayed me, trembling like leaves in a storm. Each step toward the door felt like wading through quicksand. I pushed it open, stepped into the hall, and then I saw him. Arthur, the doorman, late 50s, always polite, always unseen by the rest of the office. He stood at the end of the corridor, his cleaning cart parked beside him, hands clasped as if he'd been waiting for me. His eyes met mine. No pity, just a steady calm, like he already understood. I tried to force a smile, but my lips quivered, betraying my facade. He walked toward me, slow and certain, and reached into his pocket. His hand opened to reveal a small brass key, its edges worn with age, glinting faintly in the fluorescent light. "It's time," he whispered, his voice a quiet anchor in the chaos. I blinked, unsure I'd heard him right. Time for what? His face softened into a knowing smile, the kind that carries secrets across years. "To breathe, Amelia," he said, "to finally breathe." I used to think colored pencils were magic. When I was 6, my mom brought home a cheap pack of pencils from a dollar store near our apartment in a small Oregon town. They were dull, smelled faintly of glue, and had no brand name, but to me, they were a treasure chest. I'd sprawl on the creaky wooden floor of our living room, sketching anything my imagination could summon. Forests I'd never walked, rivers I'd only seen in pictures, creatures that lived in the margins of my library books. My parents were practical, their love for me weighed down by the grind of survival. Mom worked as a cashier at a hardware store. Dad drove a delivery truck, his shifts stretching into the night. They cared for me deeply, but it was a tired kind of care, one that left little room for dreams. "You draw real pretty, Amelia," Dad said once, glancing at a sketch I'd taped to our fridge, a crooked rainbow over a field. "But art doesn't pay the bills. You need a job that keeps you steady." I didn't know what steady meant back then. I do now. By the time I was 10, my bedroom was a gallery of doodles on napkins, the backs of school worksheets, even the insides of cereal boxes. I'd draw late into the night, my desk lamp casting a frail glow, its cord fraying at the base. Drawing felt like breathing, like I belonged somewhere, even if it was just on paper, a world where I could be free. In middle school, my art teacher, Miss Harper, pulled my parents aside after a parent-teacher night. I eavesdropped from the hallway as she told them I had real potential, that there were scholarships, programs, a path beyond a hobby. Mom nodded politely, her smile tight. Dad barely spoke. In the car, he said, "We can't afford dreams, Amelia. You want to be broke at 30, still crashing with us?" That night, I hid my sketchbook for 2 weeks. It felt like I was suffocating, each day a struggle to keep my lungs from collapsing. In high school, I worked weekends at a coffee shop, saving every tip for college. I chose marketing, safe, stable, in demand. People said I could draw on the side, but between classes and shifts, I was too exhausted to even try. By 20, I had an associate's degree, a partial scholarship, and an entry-level job at a small ad agency. I'd earned my parents' pride, but I'd lost something vital in the trade. Once, during a college break, I wandered into a local art gallery in Portland. The paintings were bold, colors swirling like emotions too big for the canvas. I stood in front of a vivid acrylic piece so long that a staff member asked if I needed help. I was lost, though I didn't say it. I was searching for a piece of myself I'd buried. At 23, I joined Tech Solutions, a mid-sized marketing firm with big clients and bigger egos. Full benefits, decent pay, a desk with my name on a tag. "That's something to build on," Dad said. I nodded, but inside, a small light flickered, dimming with every agreement. The office was all glass and steel, reflecting the Boston skyline like a mirror. It smelled of fresh coffee and ambition, polished floors, silent elevators, people in crisp shirts and overpriced loafers. My job? Crafting ad campaigns, analyzing metrics, sitting through meetings where executives debated click-through rates and ROI. No one talked about beauty or wonder. I told myself this was success, adulthood, but my fingers still ached for a pencil. During lunch, I'd slip away to a small rooftop terrace at the back of the building, a forgotten corner with a single bench and a potted fern. I kept a pocket sketchbook in my bag, its pages worn soft from years of hiding. There, under the gray Boston sky, I'd let my hand move again. I sketched the city's jagged edges, the way clouds pressed against the horizon, a stranger shadow against the glass. I didn't draw for anyone. I drew to keep myself alive. That's where I met Arthur. He was pushing a cleaning cart along the rooftop's edge when he noticed me. He paused, rested his hands on the cart, and nodded at my sketchbook. "You've got the spark," he said, his voice rough but warm. My Eleanor used to draw like that. I didn't know how to respond. No one at Tech Solutions paid attention to Arthur. Most didn't know his name. But I smiled, and that opened the door. We started talking every few weeks, brief moments when our paths crossed. He told me about Eleanor, his late wife, who painted for the joy of it, never caring about galleries or critics. "She'd set up on the attic," he said. "It had the best light in the city. I haven't touched it since she passed, couldn't." I listened, shared bits of my own story. How I'd drawn on paper bags as a kid, how I'd turned down an art scholarship, how no one at work knew I even owned a sketchbook. Arthur never judged. He just said, "Eleanor would have liked you." Those talks became my lifeline, the only honest moments in days filled with buzzwords and fake smiles. My colleagues barely registered me unless they needed a campaign tweak. I was reliable, quiet, invisible, exactly how Mr. Thorne liked his team. But Arthur saw me. Not the marketer, not the metrics girl. Me. Sometimes I think he sensed I was fading long before I did. Arthur's words lingered in the air like a faint echo, the brass key warm in my palm as if it held a heartbeat of its own. I stood frozen in the hallway of Tech Solutions, the weight of the cardboard box in my arms, a cruel reminder of the life I just lost. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow that made the world feel sharper, colder. My name, Amelia Hayes, terminated, still stung like a fresh bruise, each syllable a reminder of Mr. Thorne's icy voice in the room full of colleagues who wouldn't meet my eyes. I clutched the key tighter, its edges pressing into my skin, and glanced at the slip of paper Arthur had handed me. The address, 214 Cedar Avenue, was written in his careful, blocky handwriting, a quiet promise in a storm of uncertainty. I wanted to ask him more, to understand what he meant by breathe, but he was already gone, his cart rattling faintly down the corridor, leaving me alone with a mystery I wasn't sure I deserved. The walk back to my desk felt endless, each step a battle against the tremor in my legs. My cubicle, once a small corner of stability, now looked like a stranger's space. The cardboard box HR had left was already half-packed. A photo of Mom smiling at a county fair, a mug that read, "Coffee fixes everything," a tiny fern I'd kept alive despite the office's dry air, and my sketchbook, its cover faded, untouched for months. I stood there, staring at the remnants of a life I no longer belonged to, while around me, keyboards clacked like nothing had happened. No one looked up, no one said goodbye. The silence was sharper than Mr. Thorne's words, a blade that cut deeper with every averted gaze. I gathered the last of my things, a pen, a notebook, a stray earring, and placed them in the box. My hands trembled as I lifted it, the weight heavier than it should have been, as if it carried every unspoken word from the meeting room. I made my way down the main hallway one last time, the polished floors reflecting the city skyline through the glass walls. I didn't know where I was headed. Home, the parking garage, or some void where forgotten people drift. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here, in this place that had stripped me bare. Outside, the Boston rain had thickened, a gray curtain blurring the world beyond. I set the box in my car and drove aimlessly for a while, the key still in my pocket, its presence a quiet hum against my thigh. The city lights streaked like blurred memories, each one a reminder of the dreams I'd buried to fit into Tech Solutions' mold. I thought of my parents, their practical voices echoing in my head. Art doesn't pay the bills, Amelia. I thought of the years I'd spent proving them right, trading color for conformity, breath for balance sheets. By the time I got home, the rain had soaked through my coat, my blonde hair clinging to my face in damp strands. My apartment, a small one-bedroom in Capitol Hill, felt emptier than usual. I dropped the box on the kitchen counter and sank onto the couch, the key now in my hand. I turned it over and over, its worn brass catching the dim light of a nearby lamp. Severance pay, job applications, rent. The practical side of me screamed to focus, to survive. But another part, one I thought I'd silenced long ago, whispered something softer. Go. Around midnight, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my keys and drove, the city quiet, except for the steady patter of rain on my windshield. Streetlights glowed like lonely sentinels, guiding me through the dark. I followed Arthur's directions, left on Pine, right past the old theater, down a street of modest homes with sagging porches and flickering lights. 214 Cedar Avenue was a small crafts house with a patchy lawn and a faded mailbox, the kind of place you'd pass without a second glance. But behind it, down a narrow gravel path, stood a detached attic shed with weathered green siding and a slanted roof. A soft amber light glowed above its door, a beacon in the night. I stepped out of the car, the key heavy in my fist, and approached. The lock resisted at first, the mechanism stiff with age, but after a gentle jiggle, it clicked open. The door creaked as I pushed it inward, and I stepped inside. The air smelled of old paint, cedar, and a faint hint of lavender, a scent that felt like a memory I hadn't lived. The space was small, no bigger than my apartment's living room, but it felt vast, alive. Tall windows lined one wall, draped in sheer curtains that must have let sunlight flood in during the day. Shelves held jars of dried brushes, half-squeezed tubes of paint, and sketchbooks stacked like secrets. In the center, a canvas stood, covered by a sheet, untouched. I didn't lift the sheet. Instead, I let my fingers trail over a worn workbench, brushing against a set of charcoal sticks, a stained apron, a chipped mug with paint clinging to its rim. This wasn't just a room. It was a life paused mid-breath, waiting for someone to step into its rhythm. On the workbench, beneath a tin of pencils, I found an envelope with my name, Amelia, in careful, slanted script. Inside, a letter from Arthur. Amelia, Eleanor always said this attic had a soul. She believed the walls absorbed every stroke, every whisper, and gave it back tenfold. When she passed, I couldn't face coming here. But when I saw you sketching on the rooftop that day, I saw her light in you. This place is yours now. Not a handout, but a recognition. You're an artist, even if the world tried to tell you otherwise. Life's too short to live someone else's plan. Arthur. I sank into a rickety chair, my chest tight with grief and something dangerously close to hope. For a long time, I sat in silence, the letter trembling in my hands. The rain outside softened to a murmur, as if the world was holding its breath with me. Then, almost without thought, I reached for a sketch pad on the shelf. My hands shook as I found a piece of charcoal, its edges rough but usable. I turned to a blank page and drew a line, uneven, raw, but mine. For the first time in years, I breathed a deep, shuddering breath that felt like waking up. Things at Tech Solutions had started shifting 2 years ago. Optimization, they called it, more meetings, tighter budgets, fewer faces. Survivors didn't celebrate. They worked longer, laughed less, aged quicker. I was one of them. Lucky. Mr. Thorne had always been cold, but post-restructuring, he turned vicious, his gaze hunting for weakness, and he zeroed in on me. He'd criticize me in meetings for lacking vision, even when I wasn't presenting. He'd email directors about minor errors, things that didn't matter, like a misplaced comma in a report. When I got things right, he said nothing. His silence was a weapon, and I let it carve me down. I told myself he was under pressure, that I just needed to work harder. But no matter how early I arrived, or how late I stayed, he kept coming, and I kept shrinking. My sketchbook, once a constant in my bag, ended up buried in a drawer, untouched. I hadn't drawn in months. Every time I thought about it, Dad's voice echoed. Art doesn't pay the bills. Mornings in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. Sunken eyes, a blazer that fit too well because I'd worn it too long. I traded color for campaigns, breath for metrics. I stopped joining colleagues for lunch, not because I chose to, but because no one noticed when I vanished from the break room. My voice softened, my laugh faded. I was fading. Arthur saw it. He didn't say much at first, just watched as he passed me in the hall. One day, he stopped. "You're moving like you've got weights on your shoulders." "Just tired, Arthur," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't return it. "No, Amelia, it's heavier than tired. I wanted to break down right there, in front of the doorman with his cart and his knowing eyes, but I swallowed it, like always, and walked away." That night, I'd pulled out my sketchbook and stared at a blank page. My hand hovered, but no lines came. It was like I'd forgotten how to start, or if I was even allowed to. I closed it and buried it again. Some people crash and burn. I was dissolving, one ad campaign at a time. But now, in Eleanor's attic, with that first jagged line on the page, something shifted. It wasn't much, just a scratch of charcoal, but it felt like a crack in a dam, a small release of something I'd held back for too long. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of possibility, a whisper of breath I hadn't known I'd lost. That first line on the page felt like a spark in a long, dark room, faint, but undeniable. I sat in Eleanor's attic at 214 Cedar Avenue, the charcoal trembling in my hand, the jagged mark on the sketch pad, a small rebellion against the years I'd spent silencing myself. The Boston rain had eased into a soft drizzle, its rhythm a quiet companion as I exhaled a shaky breath that seemed to loosen something deep inside me. For the first time in years, I felt a whisper of life, a thread of color weaving through the gray I'd wrapped myself in. The attic was a sanctuary, its walls holding the ghosts of Eleanor's creativity. I could almost feel her presence in the worn brushes, the half-used tubes of paint, the faint scent of lavender that clung to the air like a memory. The letter from Arthur rested on the workbench beside me, its words a steady heartbeat. "You're an artist, even if the world tried to tell you otherwise." I traced the slanted script with my fingertip, a lifeline in the chaos of the past day. I didn't know what came next, but in that moment, I knew I couldn't go back to the woman I'd been at Tech Solutions. Reliable and invisible, fading. I stayed in the attic until the early hours, the amber porch light casting a warm glow through the tall windows. I drew without purpose, letting my hand move as it hadn't in years. I sketched the cracked mug on the shelf, its rim stained with old paint, the gauzy curtains that seemed to hold secrets in their folds, the silhouette of a bird that landed briefly on the windowsill, its wings a fleeting shadow against the glass. The lines were messy, raw, but they were mine, each one a small act of defiance against the voice in my head, my father's voice, Mr. Thorne's voice, that had told me art was a dead end. When the sky began to lighten, I closed the sketch pad and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. I locked the attic door, the brass key heavy in my pocket, and drove home. My apartment felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the attic had expanded my world beyond its walls. I placed Arthur's letter on my kitchen counter, a reminder to return, and fell into bed, exhaustion pulling me under like a tide. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I drove back to Cedar Avenue, the attic calling me like a lighthouse in a storm. The sun broke through the clouds, spilling golden light through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny constellations. I opened the sketch pad again, and this time I drew with intention. I sketched the view from the attic window: a sagging fence, a neighbor's laundry flapping in the breeze, the distant outline of the Berkshire Mountains. I drew until my fingers ached, until the page was a patchwork of lines and shadows, a map of a world I'd forgotten how to see. Days turned into weeks, and the attic became my refuge. I returned every morning, sometimes staying until the moon rose, its silver light pooling on the floor. I didn't plan what I drew. I let my hands lead, each stroke a release, like exhaling after years underwater. I filled page after page, sometimes with chaos, sometimes with quiet. I drew the garden outside, its flowers drooping under the weight of rain, the curve of Arthur's shoulders as he raked leaves in the yard. The attic itself, its shelves, a gallery of Eleanor's past. Some sketches I tore up, the sound of ripping paper a strange kind of freedom. Others I kept, taping them to the walls like small victories. You're still here, Amelia. You still matter. Arthur visited now and then, always quiet, never intrusive. Sometimes he brought a thermos of coffee, its bitter warmth a comfort as we sat in silence. Other times he came empty-handed, just watching as I worked. "You've got a glow about you," he said one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe, his gray uniform creased from a long day. I laughed, brushing charcoal dust from my cheek. "I think it's just the mess." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, Amelia. It's something deeper. I wasn't earning money yet." The severance from Tech Solutions covered rent for now, and I dipped into savings I'd set aside for emergencies, an emergency I hadn't expected to be my own unraveling. Fear lingered at the edges, a shadow that whispered I was wasting time, that I'd run out of money and lose this fragile thing I'd found. But every time doubt crept in, I'd touch the apron Eleanor had left hanging on a hook, its fabric stained with reds and blues, a testament to a woman who dared to create. It reminded me that someone had lived here before me, unafraid, and I could too. One morning, as I sketched the curve of a teacup on the workbench, Arthur's niece Olivia stopped by with her toddler, a shy boy named Leo. I was mid-drawing, my hands smudged with charcoal, when Olivia peeked at my sketch pad. "That's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. I'd been sketching Leo as he played with a wooden block, his profile a study in concentration. "Can I buy it?" she asked. I blinked, caught off guard. "It's just a sketch," I said, embarrassed. She smiled, cradling Leo against her hip. "It's him. That's enough." She handed me $40, a small gesture that felt monumental. After she left, I sat on the attic floor, the crumpled bills in my hand, and cried. Not for the money, but because someone had seen value in something I'd made. It cracked something open inside me, a door I'd kept locked for too long. I started sharing my work online, hesitantly at first, posting sketches on a simple website I built late at night. Olivia shared the drawing of Leo in a local moms group, and soon a few orders trickled in. A pet portrait, a nursery illustration, a small commission for a wedding invitation. I began saying yes to things I'd once dismissed. A mural for a neighborhood bakery, a drawing of someone's childhood home, a logo for a small startup. I was learning to live by instinct, by color, by the pull of my own heart. Within 3 months, I had a handful of clients, enough to cover utilities, though rent still loomed like a storm cloud. I insisted on paying Arthur a small rent for the attic, even though he protested every time I handed him the envelope. "You don't owe me, Amelia," he'd say. But I did. I owed him for seeing me when no one else had. I bought new supplies, fresh pencils, a set of watercolors, a sturdy easel, and painted the attic walls a soft ivory, brightening the space without erasing its essence. Eleanor was still here, in the quiet corners, in the way the room seemed to hum with warmth. On a shelf above the workbench, I placed a photo I'd found in one of her sketchbooks. A faded image of her standing in the attic, mid-laugh, her hands streaked with paint. Some days I'd whisper to it, a quiet thank you, hoping she could hear. The fear didn't vanish. It clung to the edges, especially on slow days when no orders came. But every time I held a pencil, I felt stronger, more anchored. I wasn't where I wanted to be, but I was no longer running from who I was. And that was enough. One morning, as I cleaned the workbench, I found a small tin tucked behind a jar of brushes. Inside was a collection of old paint chips, each labeled in Eleanor's handwriting. Sunset Glow, 1989. River Mist, 92. They were a timeline of her life, each color a story, and I wondered what colors I'd leave behind. I started experimenting, mixing paints to find my own shades. I called one Boston Dusk, a deep gray blue that mirrored the city's skyline at twilight. Another, First Breath, was a soft gold, the color of the light that had filled the attic that first morning. Each hue felt like a piece of me reclaimed from the years I'd spent in grayscale. I wasn't just drawing, I was rebuilding, stroke by stroke, a life I'd almost lost. The attic at 214 Cedar Avenue had become my world, a quiet haven where I could hear my own thoughts again. Each morning, I arrived as the first light crept through the tall windows, the Boston skyline a faint silhouette against the dawn. The space smelled of fresh paint and cedar, a scent that grounded me as I set up my easel, my hands already itching to create. I was no longer Amelia Hayes, the invisible marketer from Tech Solutions. I was Amelia, the artist, and every brushstroke felt like a step closer to the woman I was meant to be. 2 years had passed since that brutal day in the conference room, and the name Amelia Hayes was starting to appear in small corners of the art world. Local blogs, community newsletters, a modest blurb in a Boston arts magazine. Emerging artist known for evocative sketches and heartfelt portraits. I'd laugh whenever I saw it, a quiet chuckle at the absurdity of being known. The girl who'd once shrunk in a cubicle, buried under metrics and Mr. Thorne's disdain, could never have imagined such a thing. I'd built a steady rhythm. I had enough commissions now to need help with the logistics, emails, invoices, shipping. A college student named Chloe with a knack for organization and a shy smile came in twice a week to manage the admin work. I'd grown a client list, shipping pieces across Massachusetts, New York, and even a few to California. 3 local cafes displayed my murals on their walls. Floral designs, cityscapes, a whimsical map of Boston's hidden gems. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was mine, every stroke a thread tying me back to the attic, to Arthur, to Eleanor. The fear still lingered, a shadow that crept in during quiet weeks when orders slowed, but it was softer now, less suffocating. I'd learned to live with it, to let it sit in the corner while I worked. I'd upgraded the attic over time, brighter lights, a new coat of ivory paint on the walls, a small heater for the chilly Boston winters. But I kept its soul intact. Eleanor's presence was still here, in the worn apron on its hook, the shelves of her supplies, the photo of her laughing mid-paint that I kept on the workbench. I'd whisper to it sometimes, a quiet, "I'm trying, Eleanor. I hope you'd be proud." Arthur visited less often now. His arthritis had worsened, the Boston dampness settling into his joints. But when he did come, he moved through the attic like a man visiting a sacred place. I think in his mind, it still belonged to Eleanor, and in a way, it did. It belonged to both of us now, a shared space where her light and mine intertwined. One morning, as I sorted through a box of new brushes, I found a small photograph tucked in an old sketchbook of Eleanor's. A black and white image of her and Arthur, younger, standing by a lake in the Berkshire Mountains. They were in their 40s, arms around each other, smiling with a natural ease that stole my breath. Eleanor's cheeks glowed with joy, her hands smudged with paint as always. Arthur looked lighter, unburdened by the years that would follow. There was so much life in that photo, and so much loss now that she was gone. I stared at it for a long time, the ache in my chest a mix of reverence and longing. An idea took root, quiet but insistent, like a seed breaking through soil. It wasn't a commission, it wasn't for sale, and it had no deadline. But I knew the moment I touched the canvas that it might be the most important thing I'd ever create. For weeks, I worked on the painting in secret, between client orders and late-night sketching sessions. I poured everything I had into it, every technique I'd learned, every emotion I'd carried since that day Arthur handed me the key. I didn't recreate the photo exactly. I reimagined it, painting Arthur and Eleanor as they might have been now, older, their wrinkles deeper, their hair grayer, but together. They sat on a bench by that same lake, her hand resting in his, a paintbrush still tucked behind her ear, her laughter frozen in mid-bloom. Arthur's face held the quiet strength I knew so well, but with a softness I imagined he'd worn in her presence, a peace that came from being whole. The day I finished, I sat back on the attic floor, the canvas glowing under the skylight, and let the tears come. They weren't sad tears, but something deeper. Gratitude, closure, a kind of love I hadn't known I could feel for two people I'd never met. I called Arthur that evening, my voice steady despite the knot in my throat. "I have something to show you," I said. He arrived the next morning, wearing his best jacket, a faded denim one with a small tear at the cuff. His hands shook slightly as I handed him a mug of chamomile tea, the steam curling between us like a quiet promise. I led him to the back corner of the attic where the painting stood, draped in a linen cloth. "I have a gift for you," I said, my voice soft but sure. He looked at me, his eyes tired but kind. "Amelia, you don't owe me anything." I smiled, a small trembling thing. "I know, but I owe her." I pulled the cloth away, and Arthur froze, his breath catching like a stone in his chest. He stared at the canvas, his body so still I worried he'd stopped breathing. His eyes welled, tears spilling over without warning, tracing the lines of his weathered face. He reached out, not to touch the painting, but to brace himself against the workbench, his knuckles white. "How?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "How did you know?" "I found the photo," I said quietly, stepping closer. The rest was imagination and gratitude. He nodded, unable to speak, his gaze locked on the painting. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with the mischievous joy I'd imagined she'd carried her whole life, and Arthur looked like the man I knew, but softer, as if her presence had smoothed the edges of his grief. We stood in silence, the attic holding us like a cradle, the skylight casting a gentle glow over the canvas. After a long moment, he turned to me, his voice trembling but sure. "You didn't just give me a painting, Amelia," he said. "You gave her back to me." I reached out, taking his hand, its warmth grounding me. "And you gave me a future." His fingers tightened around mine, a silent pact between two people who'd found healing in the same small space. The weeks that followed felt lighter, as if the painting had lifted a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. I kept creating, my client list growing slowly but steadily. I illustrated a series of greeting cards for a local stationery shop, painted a mural for a community center, even designed a small tattoo for a barista who'd seen my work at the bakery. Each project was a brick in the foundation of a life I was building, one I could finally call my own. One afternoon, a woman named Maya stopped by the attic. She'd found me online, a friend of a friend who'd bought one of my pet portraits. She was in her late 20s, with a nervous energy that reminded me of myself years ago. Fingers twisting the strap of her bag, eyes bright with something wild and hesitant. "I was wondering if you ever take students," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always drawn, but I don't know how to start." I looked at her, seeing the girl I'd been. Afraid, yearning, stuck, and I nodded. "Yes," I said, the word coming easier than I expected. "I'd love to help," because someone had made space for me, and now it was my turn. Maya's face lit up, a spark igniting in her eyes, and I knew I'd made the right choice. That night, I stood alone in the attic, the tall windows reflecting the city lights like a constellation of possibilities. I caught my reflection in the glass, hair tied back in a messy bun, charcoal smudged on my cheek, paint flecking my fingertips, even my neck. Blues and greens like a map of the day's work. I looked alive, not perfect, not famous, but seen. And that was more than I'd ever dared to hope for. Arthur had once told me, "The right doors open at the right time, but it's up to us to walk through them." I hadn't understood then, but I did now. Sometimes the door was a real one, old and creaky at the end of a gravel path in Boston. Sometimes it was a canvas, a sketch pad, a single trembling line drawn in the dark. But always, it was the moment you stopped asking for permission to be who you were. The world hadn't given me that key. Arthur had, Eleanor had, and now I held it with purpose, not fear. I thought of them often, their quiet courage woven into every piece I created. Arthur still visited when his knees allowed, though the Boston winters were hard on him now. He'd shuffle through the attic, his eyes tracing the walls where my sketches hung beside Eleanor's old brushes, a silent dialogue between past and present. "You've done her proud," he said once, his voice rough with emotion. I hoped he was right. Last month I'd finished a mural for a children's library in Capitol Hill, a sprawling scene of animals reading under a starry sky. The librarian, a kind woman named Ms. Davies, had teared up when I unveiled it. "It's like you brought magic to the walls," she said. I'd smiled, thinking of Eleanor, of how she'd painted not for praise, but because she had to, because, as Arthur said, it was the only way she could breathe. I understood that now, the need to create not for others, but for yourself, to keep your soul from fading. The book contract with Bright Leaf Press was a turning point. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady work, a chance to build something lasting. I'd already started on the first book, sketching a fox with a lantern, its glow lighting a path through enchanted trees. Each illustration felt like a letter to the girl I'd been, the one who'd drawn on paper bags and dreamed of oceans she'd never seen. I was telling her, "You made it. You're here." I still had slow days, moments when fear whispered that this life was too fragile, that I'd wake up and find myself back in that cubicle, invisible again. But I'd learned to quiet those whispers. With a pencil in my hand, with the warmth of the attic around me, with the memory of Arthur's steady gaze and Eleanor's laughter in that black and white photo. I wasn't rich, but I was free, and that was worth more than any paycheck from Tech Solutions. As I stood in the attic that evening, the city lights twinkling beyond the window like a scattered constellation, I knew who I was. I was Amelia Hayes, an artist, and I was home. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been rain, silence, years of fading. But every step had led me here, to a life painted in colors I'd chosen, to a reflection I could finally meet with pride. I picked up a brush, dipped it in a soft gold I'd named First Breath, and added a final stroke to the fox's lantern, its light a beacon on the page, a mirror to the light I'd found within myself. Amelia's story is a powerful reminder that life doesn't always go according to plan. And sometimes, what seem like the worst events open doors to the best opportunities. It conveys a message of resilience, self-discovery, and the importance of pursuing one's true passion. Despite facing rejection, family doubts, and societal pressure, Amelia found her own path, not just as a career, but as a way of life. The central message is, never give up on who you truly are and what you genuinely yearn for. Life might push you onto unexpected roads, but it is in these most challenging moments that you can find the strength to reinvent yourself and build a future that resonates with your soul. Listen to your inner voice, trust your abilities, and dare to walk through the doors life opens for you. Because, as Arthur said, the important thing is to breathe, to live an authentic and fulfilling life, not to please others, but to find peace and joy within yourself.